Hey guys, welcome back to another Why No One Plays video. Today's episode is a special one because we'll be covering a champion who used to be quite possibly the most popular jungler in the game a few years ago, even more so during seasons 4 and 5, where his pick rate would easily climb to around 30%, counting for almost 1 in every 3 games. In seasons 10, 11, 12, and now 13 though, his presence has tapered off dramatically, only having a patch or two's worth of success midway through season 11. I find this case a bit of a head scratcher. Jarvan IV had a very storied history as a champion who could survive and thrive in the jungle at a time when very few were able to on account of being far more hostile and less rewarding than it is now. More confounding is how digestible yet effective his abilities are, an aspect that typically inspires a lot of usage. Only one way to find out. Let's investigate the downfall of Jarvan IV, why no one plays him anymore. Before we continue though, I have a quick shout out for today's sponsor. Hextech Store is back once again. It's a place where you can purchase Hextech crafting related items like orbs, chests, or keys at a discounted price. If you like to buy orbs and chests often, you can get more for your money by using their store. After purchase, they gift you the items in game. You can also use my code Vars for another discount as well. To celebrate the new Winter Blessed skin line, they're giving away 100 orbs in their Discord server, so go check it out. Thanks again as usual to Hextech Store for sponsoring the video, but for now let's get back into it. There is debatably no one who's more synonymous with the diver subclass. As the name suggests, divers represent the more mobile portion of the fighter archetype, excelling at charging headfirst into battle, usually to single out a high priority target and immediately force them and their teammates to deal with the diver's presence. What separates them from the Vanguard tank subclass is kill pressure. What they lack in resilience, they make up for by dispatching the enemy carries more easily in comparison, and Jarvan could not be a more textbook example of this. Now, despite being next in line to rule as the Crown Prince of Demacia, the man prefers to be the first one in a fight and faces opposition head-on, not unlike his other brothers-in-arms, Garen and Xinjiao. The difference between him and them is that Jarvan's a bit more balanced, possessing an equal spread of damage, durability, crowd control, mobility, even utility, hence why his ratings on the wiki are evenly distributed. His most noteworthy trait is of course his massively wide threat range. By throwing Demacian Standard to a target area, he can then cast Dragon Strike at it to pull himself to the flag's location, doubling as a dash that knocks up all enemies around him and along the path. Given the max cast range of his E being 1000 units, he effectively has a 1000 range dash. I'm gonna go on a small tangent for a moment. This has to be one of my favorite design interactions of all time, considering he was released back in season 1, creating a more innovative way for a champion to have a dash knockup type ability instead of making another version of Gragas or Sejuani's dash is the kind of stuff I wish Riot would do more often, instead of just giving every champion a regular dash like they always do. Anyways, 1000 units already puts Jarvan's distance coverage magnitudes ahead of most junglers, but that's only one of his 2 gap closers. The other is Cataclysm, a 650 range targeted dash that deals damage to all enemies nearby on arrival while erecting a circle of terrain, trapping anyone caught in it unless they dash out. Altogether, Jarvan is capable of closing up to 1650 units of range. Some divers can't even go half as far, let alone anywhere close. Although, in contrast to Camille, who can travel 1600 units with a single ability, Jarvan has to exhaust 3 of them. With that said, he has the added privilege of attacking multiple targets at once, and can deal quite a bit of damage through Dragon Strike and Cataclysm if he builds AD. I mean seriously, you're staring down 320% bonus AD in just 2 hits, nothing to scoff at. In true diver fashion, Jarvan also has a bit of defense on his side in the form of Golden Aegis, slowing all nearby enemies for 2 seconds and building a shield that increases by a portion of his max health for every enemy champion nearby. Admittedly, it's not a very impressive shield, seeing as it only caps out at 140 base plus 6.5% max health if he catches the entire enemy team, at least as of making this video. For comparison, Diana's Pale Cascade shields for 200 base plus 50% of her AP plus 18% of her bonus health, although I will explain why Jarvan's shield is so weak a bit later. Mediocre numbers aside, the presence of Golden Aegis is very in tune with this win condition. He's more likely than not going to be smack dab in the center of a team fight, so getting the most value out of his shield isn't as onerous as it may seem. So as you can see, his entire kit is tailor-made towards a single goal: engage. Jarvan's initial claim to fame was his insane gank pressure. As mentioned before, he has a total distance coverage of 1650 units. That's more than double what some other divers are able to pull off. And remember, this was back in seasons 1 through 5, when mobility wasn't nearly as rampant. Furthermore, his ultimate was able to trap the enemy target long enough for the rest of his team to catch up. That is, if the enemy team couldn't escape the arena, which again was still few and far between at the time. The only other jungler with comparable distance coverage was Lee Sin, but in his case, he didn't have the same consistency since he had to land his Q first. There was also the added skill floor of mechanics. Jarvan's engage, on the other hand, was really easy to pull off. He was a very straightforward diver, but a damn good one at that. A paragon of a champion who was designed to have one job and one job only. If you think about it, that was how a lot of old veterans operated. Jax, Malphite, Rammus, and so on were engineered to shut down auto attackers and AD carries. Janna focused on disengage. Malzahar was all about locking down one target. Every champion's identity was conceptualized around a single purpose or function. That also meant they were balanced around how important that function was. As time passed, that notion was all but thrown out the window. Now there's no restrictions, no limitations, no boundaries on what a champion is allowed to have. And it's here that we encounter his biggest problem. Jarvan IV's kit is failing to withstand the test of time. The addition of new divers and redesigns of old ones have gradually overshadowed the impact his moveset offers by doing more than what he could. Remember, it's not just one or two abilities that make up his diving potential, it's all of his abilities. Granted, I would argue he still has some of the best teamfight engage in the game, but that's all he has. Other champs may not gap close as far as him, but they bring a lot more to the table. In terms of new divers, we have champions like Camille. Obviously her engage isn't nearly as explosive as she can really only hit one person, but her combat pressure far exceeds anything Jarvan can pull off by a mile. She not only can dive the backline from 2 screens away, but still has enough damage to one-shot them, whereas Jarvan has to blow all of his cooldowns just to get in range. That's another thing. Jarvan's damage is tied to his engage. While he is capable of dealing huge amounts of damage with Dragon Strike and Cataclysm, that's only if you're already in range of the enemy team. If you have to use Dragon Strike to get in range of Cataclysm, you lose out on that damage and more importantly Armor Shred, which he relies on a lot since all he has afterwards are auto attacks. Camille doesn't lose any DPS uptime to use Hookshot and Hextech Ultimatum because their damage is tied to Precision Protocol and Tactical Sweep. They function mutually exclusive from one another. As for reworks, we have Diana and Irelia. First off, it's debatable as to whether or not they have worse engage than Jarvan. Provided minions or other targets are nearby, both of them can reset their dash abilities, but we obviously know why they're sometimes more dangerous. Diana packs even more AoE damage than J4, especially with the new Moonfall and the AoE basic attack, while Irelia is, Irelia. Many people mistake her for a skirmisher like Fiora due to her insane 1v1 potential, but in reality she's a diver, one of the most annoying in the game. Uptime is really the main thing that Jarvan suffers from though. Nowadays, most divers still have enough gas in the tank to pose a veritable threat to a carry's life if they're not dealt with immediately. Jarvan's one of the few exceptions to this. I'm not saying you can outright ignore him and move on with your day, but a majority of his pressure is his engage, which doesn't leave much else for DPS. So even though he has some of the best engage in the game, he puts virtually all of his eggs into that basket and has none left over for the other areas. The other divers are more balanced out. Wukong for instance does more or less the same thing Jarvan does with the dash knockup and stuff, only he has more uptime and can continue fighting for long periods of time. Wukong and by extension other meta divers have something else they can do while they wait for the gap closes to come off cooldown. Unfortunately, this power creep, if we want to call it that, has resulted in their sister class, the Juggernauts, to bleed into diver territory as well. If you're looking for more raid boss potential, there's Aatrox, Shyvana, and Set, who possess some way to also run headfirst into the enemy team but have way more durability and damage. Volibear and Udyr may not travel as quickly, but with their movement speed abilities they can charge headfirst too. Juggernauts are a lot faster than they used to be. In other words, what made Jarvan so special isn't really special anymore. You might ask, what about other old champions? Why aren't they suffering from the same loss of relevance? It's not the champion that determines that, it's the role. What allowed Jarvan to succeed during the early days of League was the more primitive nature of the jungle. Monster camps did a lot more damage, sustain wasn't as good, and resources were in short supply. The only champions who made it as junglers were those who could function well on limited resources, which were usually just tanks. Jarvan players nowadays go AD Bruiser, but back then he would mostly go full tanks since tanks naturally required less gold than carries, relying on base numbers and crowd control to provide for their team. It's the same reason that Gragas, Rek'Sai, and Olaf went full tank back in the day, but now you see them going full damage or Bruiser at the very least. You couldn't afford to build DPS as a jungler, there simply wasn't enough gold available. Throughout the past going on 13 years of this game, the jungle has increasingly become more influential. Junglers have access to more gold and experience. Everyone more or less full clears without taking damage anymore, and their carry potential has gone from being memed on as a second support to now arguably the strongest role in history, especially when taking into consideration the growing significance of neutral objectives like Dragon and Baron. These factors place more emphasis on the jungler's ability to exert pressure early on. Consequently, this had an adverse effect on Jarvan's presence for many reasons. Chief among them is the higher frequency of early game fights. Jarvan's clear speed is passable at best, and his damage output is definitely a couple of more aggressive hypercarry picks, which gets even worse the later a game goes. So while his gank pressure is still top tier, it's somewhat held back by his unimpressive everything else. He's really only able to carry games by ganking as often as possible, but jungling is no longer just ganking anymore. In fact, I feel like in modern times the dynamic between junglers and laners has flipped upside down. Normally the jungler is supposed to gank the laner, but in this day and age I find that it's the laner ganking the jungler. We see this happen all the time now in solo queue. Whichever laner has priority rotates with their jungler to invade the enemy jungler or secure Scuttle Crab or whatever, because winning jungle takes precedence over winning lane. There's just more fighting going on now that junglers are able to keep up with laners and items. Jarvan's not the best at dueling, not unless he's really far ahead, but you can only get so far ahead in 5 to 10 minutes. The modern day jungle allows some more DPS champs through buffs and reworks than ever before. 5 years ago, you would be out of your mind to go Talon, Zed, Diana, Talia, Karthus and such in the jungle. There's also the damage meta. Season 12 and 13 is weaning us off of it, but that's a large part of why Jarvan's pick rate fell off a cliff. He just doesn't bring enough damage anymore and has a less than favorable matchup spread. Most of the champs he loses to happen to be carry junglers. Below average dueling potential is also why you don't really see Jarvan being played top either. We've had a few champions migrate out of the jungle and into top lanes such as Gragas, Olaf, and even Zac and Sejuani. Same reasons before, not the best matchups. Jarvan gets totally destroyed by the 4 horsewomen at top lane, Fiora, Riven, Camille, and Irelia. He gets out-sustained by lane bullies, Darius, Renekton, Mordekaiser, so on and so forth. So even though you can play him top lane, he's very counterpickable. Jarvan can't weaponize his engage as lane pressure since he doesn't have enough damage to back it up on his own. Then there's objectives. Jarvan's underwhelming damage and clear also makes it difficult for him to quickly secure objectives, and often needs his teammates to help or at least shadow him just in case someone else shows up. His vulnerability to predator junglers makes trying to solo dragon or Rift Herald extremely risky, as he'll lose a lot of health and be an easy target. His sustain isn't as good as Hecarim, Olaf, or Warwick, so any damage he takes will likely remain. In general, you sort of have to play Jarvan like a tank jungler. He's not as weak, but doesn't provide enough skirmishing pressure to be labeled as big of a threat as other skirmisher junglers. His pressure is only highlighted when ganking, so you'll have to be really good at ganking, otherwise you'll lose. But ganking in and of itself is usually out of your hands. Sometimes your lanes are just not in a good spot for ganks. It's not really something you can force unless you're playing for counter ganks. But if you're playing for counter ganks, you probably don't need Jarvan's engage. You'd rather have more kill power since the enemy team saves you the trouble of engaging. All in all, because Jarvan's a textbook example of a diver, he's not the most exceptional. In solo queue, he's a jack of all trades jungler. A little bit of damage, a little bit of defense, a little bit of engage, a little bit of utility, a little bit of crowd control, but not a lot of anything. It's mainly that he doesn't do enough to justify players using him over other picks, and in some ways he's a stat checker, so the only time players use him is when he's strong. That almost never happens though. Jarvan's a pro play champion. If and whenever he's even the slightest bit effective, pro players abuse the crap out of him. I know I said a few seconds ago he's a jack of all trades, master of none, but that's only in practice. Jarvan does have a specialty, his engage, and in pro play, where teams are more coordinated, his AoE dash knockup and cataclysm makes him fantastic at setting up wombo combos. You know, J4 Rumble, J4 Misfortune, stuff like that. You can of course pull that off more consistently if you have voice comms. However, as usual, if a champion is heavily seen in pro play, they're more susceptible to the nerf hammer. Jarvan's Golden Aegis was made almost completely useless primarily due to pro play. They used to give him like 4% max health per enemy champion, and then over the years they brought it all the way down to 1.3%, barely anything. There's also this martial cadence. It keeps fluctuating from 8% current health to 10% current health back to 8% over and over again. He's just never allowed to be above average at anything except engage, otherwise he becomes pick ban OP in pro play. Riot is sort of doing to Jarvan what they did to Gragas, taking away a lot of his base numbers, particularly defense, and adding it into offense. That's why you see Jarvan players going AD Bruiser or sometimes lethality instead of tank. It's just no longer worth going tank Jarvan anymore, even though you don't really want to go damage Jarvan either, since at that point why not just play a carry. Ultimately it puts him in a weird position where he's not good as a tank or as a damage dealer. I think he deserves a mid-scope. Jarvan's current iteration depends on his engage to a fault. They should preserve his flag and drag as well as his cataclysm, but they should make up their mind on whether he should be a full-fledged diver like Lee Sin or a vanguard tank like Malphite. This hybrid style is just not working for him. Jarvan's a cool guy though, one of my favorite champs. He's still viable in solo queue, it's just power creep finally got to him and his kit is falling into obsolescence. A minor touch-up like what they did with Xin Zhao would work wonders for him. I would recommend giving him something else to do after he uses his engage instead of just auto-attacking. Anyways, this is going to be it for today. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have, please be sure to leave a like and sub to the channel. Also consider following me on Twitter at Vars, joining my Discord server, and check out my other Why No One Plays episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.